My name is Eleanor, and if anyone had told me that the simple act of stepping into a sauna one summer afternoon would change the course of my life forever, I wouldn't have believed them. At 38, I had settled into a life of quiet dissatisfaction. Marrying Richard, a wealthy man nearly 20 years my senior, seemed like a practical choice at the time. He was charming, successful, and promised stability, a sharp contrast to the tumultuous relationships of my youth. But as the years passed, the spark we once shared faded, extinguished by his constant business travels and lack of emotional connection. I was left to wander the sprawling estate alone, in a marriage that felt more like a business arrangement. Then there was Lucas Richard's son from his first marriage. At 22, Lucas was everything his father wasn't: youthful, vibrant, and painfully perceptive. He'd moved back home temporarily after graduating from college, citing a desire to save money before starting his career, but I suspected there was more to his return than he was letting on. Lucas had an energy about him that made it impossible to ignore his presence. Whether it was his sharp wit, the easy confidence in his smile, or the way his deep blue eyes seemed to see right through me. He was magnetic, and as much as I tried to maintain the boundaries of our roles, his stepmother, his father's wife, there was an undeniable tension between us, a charge that grew stronger with each passing day. It was one of those sweltering summer days when the house was suffocatingly quiet. Richard was away on another trip, leaving Lucas and me alone. I spent the morning trying to distract myself, cleaning rooms that didn't need cleaning, leafing through books I had no interest in reading. By the afternoon, the heat had become unbearable, and I remembered the sauna near the pool house, a part of the estate I rarely used. I slipped into a silk robe over my swimsuit and made my way to the sauna. Inside, the cedar-scented air enveloped me, and the low hum of the heater was a soothing balm to my restless thoughts. I let the warmth soak into my skin, leaned back against the bench, and closed my eyes. Minutes passed in peaceful solitude until I heard the door slide open. My eyes snapped open to see Lucas enter, a towel wrapped loosely around his hips. "I didn't know anyone else used that thing," he said casually, his lips curling into a slight smirk. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice sharper than I had intended. "I could ask you the same thing," he replied, leaning against the wooden wall. "I thought you didn't like saunas." "I don't," I admitted, "but today is an exception." He shrugged and sat down on the bench opposite me. His presence was overwhelming in the small room, his toned physique and damp hair drawing my attention despite my best efforts to look away. We sat in tense silence, the heat adding to the unspoken tension between us. Finally, Lucas broke the silence. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer now. I hesitated. "Why do you ask?" "You've seemed out of sorts lately," he said, as if something was bothering you. "It's nothing," I lied, hoping to deflect his concern. "Is it my dad?" he pressed, his tone laced with genuine concern. "You don't have to pretend with me, Eleanor. I can see it." The honesty in his words took me by surprise. "He's always gone," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I feel like I don't exist for him anymore." Lucas leaned forward, his expression grave. "You deserve more than that. You deserve to be seen, to be valued." His words sent a shiver down my spine despite the sweltering heat. I looked away, unsure of how to react, but then I felt his hand on mine, his touch gentle yet grounding. "You're not alone," he said softly. The heat of the sauna seemed to intensify, though I knew it wasn't just the temperature. Lucas's hand on mine sent a current through my body, a sensation that was both thrilling and terrifying. I should have pulled away, said something to re-establish the boundaries between us. But I didn't. Instead, I looked into his eyes, those piercing blue eyes that had always held a hint of mischief, but now held something deeper, something more vulnerable. "Lucas," I whispered, my voice shaking. He leaned closer, his hand still on mine. "You don't have to say anything," he said quietly. I know this is complicated, but I can't ignore how I feel when I'm around you." His words were a confession, one that hung in the charged air between us. My heart raced as I searched for the right response, but nothing came. All I could do was sit there, caught in the magnetic pull of his gaze. Before I could stop myself, I whispered, "This isn't right." "But it feels right, doesn't it?" he countered, his voice calm. I hated how much I agreed with him, how much my body betrayed my mind. The heat in the sauna was nothing compared to the heat coursing through me as he leaned closer, his face inches from mine. "I see you, Elena," he murmured. "Not as my father's wife, but as the incredible woman you are, and I can't pretend otherwise." His words were the final crack in the dam I'd been holding back for so long. Without thinking, I closed the distance between us, my lips brushing against his in a hesitant kiss. It was soft at first, testing the boundaries of what we both knew was forbidden. But when his hand moved to cup my face, the kiss deepened and all sense of restraint melted away. The walls of the sauna seemed to close in, cocooning us in a world where nothing else mattered but this moment. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I let myself get lost in the intensity of it all. For the first time in years, I felt alive, wanted, seen. The heat of the sauna blended seamlessly with the warmth emanating from Lucas's touch. It was intoxicating, overwhelming in a way I hadn't expected. My breath caught as his fingers brushed against the fabric of my robe, hesitant yet determined, as if seeking permission. I didn't stop him. I couldn't. Any rational thought dissolved under the weight of the bond that was forming between us. His lips moved softly against mine, testing, tasting, as if this moment was as surreal for him as it was for me. I felt his breath on my cheek, warm and uncertain, mirroring the racing rhythm of my heart. His hand slid to the small of my back, pressing me closer, erasing the space between us. "Lucas," I murmured, my voice barely audible, trembling with emotion. He pulled away slightly, just enough to look at me, his blue eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his voice low, rough with suppressed desire. I couldn't. My body betrayed me, leaning into him, seeking the comfort and fire he offered. My hands found their way to his chest, tracing the lines of his lean frame, memorizing the feel of him. I had spent so long in denial, living a life that felt empty and routine. And here he was, shaking me awake with every touch, every whispered breath. "Don't stop," I finally admitted, the words slipping out before I could think. That was all he needed. His lips returned to mine, more insistent this time, the hesitation replaced by certainty. The kiss deepened, each movement a declaration of the emotions we had both suppressed for so long. His hands roamed down my back, his touch igniting trails of fire along my skin, even through the thin fabric of my robe. The heat of the sauna combined with the heat of our connection was overwhelming. Beads of sweat formed on my forehead, but I didn't care. The world outside the wooden walls of the sauna no longer existed. There were no roles, no rules, just us. His hands found the knot of my robe, fingers hesitating for a moment before pulling it loose. The material slipped from my shoulders and pooled at my feet. The vulnerability of the moment hit me, but instead of fear, I felt liberated. Lucas's gaze didn't waver, his admiration evident as his eyes swept over me. "You're incredible," he said, his voice hoarse with awe. I reached up and pulled him into another kiss, desperate to feel more of him, to drown in the emotions I had kept locked away. His touch grew bolder, his hands exploring every inch of me with awe and hunger. Time seemed to stand still as we lost ourselves in each other, the outside world forgotten. For once, I allowed myself to live in the moment, to feel without fear or judgment. Lucas's lips moved from my mouth to my neck, his kisses tracing a path that left me breathless. The sound of the sauna door creaking brought us both back to reality. We froze, our breaths mingling as we listened intently. After a moment of silence, it was clear that no one was there, but the interruption was a reminder of the delicate line we were walking. I started, but Lucas silenced me with a finger to my lips. "No regrets, Eleanor," he said firmly, his voice a mixture of conviction and, as I looked into his eyes, I realized that I didn't regret a single thing. Not the kiss, not the touch, not the emotions we had unleashed. For once, I had allowed myself to feel alive, and that was something I couldn't take back. But even as we collected ourselves, the weight of what had just happened remained. That moment of passion had opened a door we couldn't close, and the consequences of stepping through it were yet to be faced. The silence between us as we left the SAA was deafening, yet it spoke volumes. The tension in the air was palpable, not from embarrassment, but from the weight of what had just happened. Lucas walked beside me, his hand occasionally brushing against mine, as if unsure whether to reach for it or keep his distance. Back in the house, the world outside resumed its hum, as if nothing monumental had just happened. But inside, every glance, every subtle movement carried a charged energy. I excused myself on the pretext of needing to check my phone and retreated to the privacy of my bedroom. Closing the door behind me, I leaned against it and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My mind raced, replaying every moment in the SAA. The way Lucas had looked at me, the intensity of his touch, the fire ignited inside me that refused to go out. How had it come about? My stepson, so much younger, and yet he had awakened something in me that I thought was long dead. Guilt began to creep in, gnawing at the edges of my euphoria. This wasn't just complicated, it was dangerous. A soft knock on the door startled me. "Elena!" Lucas's voice was low, hesitant. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob before opening it. He stood there, his hair slightly disheveled, his expression a mixture of concern and longing. "Are you all right?" he asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure it was true. "I just needed a moment to think." He came closer, his presence filling the room. "About us?" His question hung in the air, and I couldn't avoid it. "Lucas, what happened? It was real," he interrupted, his voice firm. "It wasn't just a moment, Eleanor. You felt it too." I couldn't deny it. The passion, the connection, it was undeniable. But that didn't make it right. "We have to be careful," I said, my voice shaking. "Your father—" "My father doesn't see you," Lucas said sharply, cutting me off. "He's so wrapped up in his work, his life outside this house. You deserve more than to be an afterthought, Elena." His words hit a nerve. The loneliness I had felt for years bubbled to the surface, and I found myself stepping closer to him, my hand instinctively reaching for his. "Lucas," I whispered, my voice barely audible. His hands cupped my face, his touch tender. "I don't care about right or wrong," he said, his eyes locked with mine. "I care about you." Before I could answer, his lips found mine again, and the room seemed to tilt. This kiss was different, deeper, more desperate, as if we both understood the fleeting nature of what we had. I pulled away, breathless, my hands resting on his chest. "This can't be our reality, Lucas," I said, my voice shaking. "We have to be careful." He nodded, but his eyes betrayed him, filled with determination. "I won't let this end, Eleanor. I can't." The days that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered confessions. We walked a fine line between secrecy and discovery, careful not to arouse suspicion. Lucas found reasons to linger around the house, offering to help me with chores or making up excuses to spend time together. Each encounter was charged with tension, our touches lingering longer than necessary, our glances filled with unspoken words. The intensity grew, and so did the risk. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Lucas came into the kitchen. He stood behind me, his presence overwhelming, his hands finding my waist as he leaned in close, his breath warm against my neck. "Can I help with anything?" he asked, his voice teasing. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "Lucas, we can't go on like this," I said, though my resolve was weakening. He smiled, his confidence unnerving. "Then tell me to go, Eleanor. Tell me you don't feel the same way and I'll go." I couldn't. One night, the inevitable happened. A text message from Lucas's father popped up on my phone, a simple, "Working late again tonight, don't wait up." I sat on the couch staring at the message, the weight of my decisions weighing on me. Lucas entered the room, his expression softening as he saw my troubled face. "He's not coming home, is he?" Lucas asked as he sat down beside me. I shook my head, unable to speak. He reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. "You don't have to do this alone, Eleanor," he said. The vulnerability in his voice shattered the last of my defenses. I turned towards him, my emotions spilling over. "What are we doing, Lucas? How can this ever work?" He didn't answer with words. Instead, he pulled me into his arms and held me as I let the tears fall. It happened on a quiet evening, one that felt deceptively safe. Lucas and I were sitting in the living room, the air between us charged with an intimacy that had grown over time. I had lit a few candles, their soft glow giving the room a warmth that felt almost too perfect. Lucas sat beside me on the couch, his hand resting lightly on my knee. It wasn't overt, but the gesture spoke volumes, a silent confirmation of his feelings. We were talking about nothing, really mundane things like his university assignments, the weather and plans for the weekend, but the way he looked at me, his gaze lingering just a second too long, made even the most trivial conversation seem profound. Then the front door opened. At first it didn't register. The sound was so unexpected that my mind didn't immediately connect it to its source. But when I saw Lucas's father, Mark, step through the door, his coat draped over his arm, time seemed to stand still. Mark froze in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as they scanned the scene before him. His gaze fell first on Lucas, who was sitting far too close to me for comfort. Then his eyes shifted to me, his expression darkening as he took in the candles, the wine glasses on the coffee table, and the undeniable intimacy of the room. "What's going on here?" Mark's voice was cold, sharp enough to cut through the tension. Lucas stiffened beside me, his hand slipping from my knee as if it were on fire. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mark, I didn't think you'd be home so soon," I said, my voice trembling and betraying my guilt. "That much is clear," Mark replied, his tone laced with suspicion. His eyes darted between us, searching our faces for answers. "It's not what it looks like," Lucas said, standing up as well. But his words rang hollow, unconvincing even to me. Mark's expression darkened further, and his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Then why don't you tell me what it is, Lucas?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like there's something going on between my wife and my son." The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. "Mark, please," I began, but he cut me off. "Don't!" he snapped, his anger finally breaking through the icy exterior. "Don't lie to me, Elena. I'm not an idiot." Lucas stepped forward, his jaw set in defiance. "You're right. Something is going on." My breath caught in my throat. I turned to Lucas, my eyes wide with disbelief. "Lucas, no," I whispered, but it was too late. Mark's face was flushed with anger. "You little—" He took a step towards Lucas, but I quickly moved between them, my hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Stop! Both of you, just stop!" I shouted, my voice shaking. "This is my fault, all of it. Don't blame Lucas." Mark glared at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of betrayal and disbelief. "You're damn right it's your fault," he spat. "I trusted you, Elena. I brought you into this house, made you part of this family, and this is how you repay me?" Tears welled up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "You've been absent, Mark," I said, my voice breaking. "You've been so busy with work, with everything outside this house, that I have felt invisible for years. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. But don't pretend you're blameless." Mark looked as if I had slapped him. He opened his mouth to reply, but closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words. Lucas reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. "Don't talk to her like that," he said, his voice firm. "You've ignored her, treated her like a piece of furniture. She deserves better." Mark turned to Lucas, his anger renewed. "And you think you're better? You think you can step in and be the hero?" The argument escalated, voices rose, accusations flew. I stood between them, my heart breaking as the two people I cared about most tore each other apart. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice breaking. "That's enough!" Both men fell silent, their eyes fixed on me. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This family is broken, and it's my fault. I can't stay and make it worse." Lucas looked stricken, his hand reaching for mine again. "Elena, don't!" "I have to," I said firmly, pulling away from him. "This isn't right, Lucas. It never was." Mark said nothing, his face a mask of anger and hurt. I turned and headed for the bedroom, my heart heavy with the weight of my decision. As I packed my things, tears streamed down my face, but I knew it was the only way. As I left the house that night, I didn't look back. I moved to a small flat on the other side of town, starting a life that felt both liberating and unbearably lonely. Lucas tried to contact me, sending messages and leaving voicemails, but I didn't respond. Mark filed for divorce shortly afterwards, citing irreconcilable differences. Lucas and his father barely spoke, the rift between them seemingly irreparable. I thought about Lucas often, about what we had shared and the cost of our actions. It was a bittersweet memory, one that would always haunt me. Some choices leave scars that never fully heal, but they also teach us who we are. In the end, I had to let Lucas go. Not because I didn't love him, but because loving him had nearly destroyed us both.